Marcus Bell's hands were shaking before he even reached the restaurant door, and he hated himself for it. He was 34 years old, a grown man, a father who had faced hospital corridors and funeral homes, and sleepless nights alone with a crying child. Yet the idea of sitting across from a stranger for dinner made his chest feel tight enough to crack. He stopped on the sidewalk outside the glass doors of the restaurant, looked at his own reflection, straightened his collar, and whispered to himself that he could still turn around and leave. He did not leave. He had promised his sister Karen he would go through with this, and Marcus Bell was not a man who broke promises, not even small ones, not even ones that terrified him. 2 years earlier, his wife Diane had died of a sudden illness that no one saw coming, leaving him alone with their daughter Lily, who was 4 years old at the time and did not yet understand why her mother was never coming home. Since then, Marcus had built his entire life around two things: his job as a structural engineer and being present for every single moment of his daughter's childhood. He had not been on a date in over 700 days. He had counted, though he never told anyone that. Karen had been pushing him for months. She said he was disappearing into his own grief, that Lily needed to see her father happy again, not just surviving. Marcus had resisted every suggestion, every setup, every gentle nudge, until Karen finally cornered him at a family dinner and told him she had already arranged something, that the reservation was made, that the woman was someone from her hospital's nursing staff, someone kind, someone patient, someone who understood loss, because she had seen so much of it in her work. Marcus had almost said no, but something in Karen's voice that night, some exhausted worry she could not hide, made him nod instead. Now he stood outside the restaurant, gripping the door handle, telling himself this was just one dinner, 1 hour. He could survive 1 hour. Inside, the restaurant was warm and dimly lit, the kind of place with soft music and candles on every table, clearly chosen by Karen for its romantic atmosphere. Marcus gave his name to the host and was led toward a table near the window. He sat down, ordered a glass of water because his throat had gone dry, and checked his phone twice in the span of 90 seconds. Mostly to make sure Lily's babysitter had not messaged him with an emergency. 7 minutes passed. Then the door opened, and cold night air rushed briefly into the warm room, and Marcus looked up out of instinct, the way anyone looks up when a door opens in a quiet space. A woman walked in, and something about the way she carried herself made several heads turn, though not for the reason Marcus expected. She was a larger woman, broad-shouldered and full-figured, dressed in a deep green dress that fit her with obvious intention, not apology. Her dark hair was pulled back neatly, her posture was straight, and she walked toward the host stand with the calm confidence of someone who had long ago decided she would not shrink herself for anyone's comfort. Marcus watched her exchange a few words with the host, watched the host's eyes flick briefly toward him, and understood, with a small jolt in his stomach, that this was Grace. He stood up automatically as she approached the table, the old-fashioned manners his mother had drilled into him, kicking in before his brain had time to process anything else. Grace smiled at him, a warm and easy smile that did not seem to carry any nervousness at all, and extended her hand. "You must be Marcus," she said. "Karen described you perfectly. Nervous eyes and a very serious jaw." Marcus laughed despite himself, a short, surprised sound, and shook her hand. "Guilty as charged. You must be Grace." "Guilty as well," she said, and sat down across from him with an ease that immediately made the tight knot in his chest loosen just slightly. But as they settled into their seats, Marcus became aware of something else happening around them. 2 tables away, a group of women in their 30s had gone quiet, their eyes darting between Grace and Marcus in a way that was not subtle at all. A young couple near the bar exchanged a look and a small smirk. Marcus felt his face grow warm, not from embarrassment about Grace, but from anger at the rudeness of strangers, who had decided within seconds that they had the right to judge 2 people they had never met. Grace, however, did not seem to notice, or if she did, she gave no sign of it. She picked up the menu, scanned it with mild interest, and asked Marcus what he would recommend, since Karen had mentioned he came here sometimes with his daughter for special occasions. "The grilled salmon is good," Marcus said, forcing his attention back to her, rather than the whispering tables around them. "Lily always steals half my fries, though, so I never actually get to enjoy a full meal here." "Lily," Grace repeated softly. "Your daughter." Karen talks about her all the time at the hospital. Apparently, she drew a picture of a dinosaur wearing a tie last week and gave it to one of the nurses because she said the dinosaur looked lonely. Marcus blinked, surprised. She did do that. I didn't know Karen had told anyone. Karen adores her, Grace said. And honestly, from everything I have heard, Lily sounds like a remarkable kid. There was something in the way Grace said it, unhurried and sincere, that made Marcus relax his shoulders for the first time all evening. He had expected small talk, the kind that skated across the surface of things and never touched anything real. Instead, within the first 5 minutes, this stranger was already asking about the one part of his life that mattered most to him, and she was asking without performance, without the practiced sympathy people often used when they learned he was a widowed father. Still, the whispering at the nearby tables continued, low and persistent, and Marcus could not fully ignore it no matter how hard he tried. He glanced sideways once, saw one of the women lean toward her friend and say something behind her hand, and felt his jaw tighten. Grace noticed his glance. She did not turn to look at the other table herself. Instead, she simply said, in a voice calm enough that only Marcus could hear it, "People love to have opinions about things that are none of their business. I stopped letting it ruin my dinners a long time ago." Marcus studied her for a moment, this woman who had walked into a room full of quiet judgment, and had not flinched once, and felt something shift in his chest that he could not yet name. It was not attraction exactly, not yet, not in the way he remembered attraction feeling. It was something closer to respect, sudden and startling in its intensity. The waiter arrived to take their order, and for a few minutes the conversation stayed light, drifting between favorite foods and terrible childhood memories, and the strange things Karen had told each of them about the other. Marcus learned that Grace had grown up 2 towns over, that she had 3 older brothers who used to tease her mercilessly and now called her every single Sunday without fail, that she had wanted to be a veterinarian as a child before deciding, at 16, that she wanted to work with people instead of animals. "What made you switch?" Marcus asked. Grace was quiet for a moment, turning her water glass slowly between her fingers. "My grandmother got sick when I was 16, cancer. I spent a lot of time in hospital rooms that year, just sitting with her, watching the nurses work. There was one nurse in particular, an older woman named Helen, who used to talk to my grandmother like she was still a whole person, not just a diagnosis. She would ask about my grandmother's garden, her opinions on old movies, silly things like that. It made the whole experience feel less frightening. I decided that year I wanted to be like Helen for someone else, someday." Marcus felt something tighten in his throat. He thought of the nurses who had cared for Diane in her final weeks, of the ones who had been kind and the ones who had simply gone through the motions, and he understood immediately the weight of what Grace was describing. "That's exactly what nursing needs more of," he said quietly. "People who remember that the patient is still a whole person." Grace looked at him then, something curious and warm passing over her face, as though she was recalculating something about him. "Karen told me you lost your wife. I am sorry, Marcus. I did not want to bring it up first, but I did not want to pretend I did not know either." Marcus nodded slowly, grateful, oddly, that she had said it plainly instead of dancing around it the way most people did. Diane, 2 years ago. It was sudden. 1 week she was fine, the next she was gone. Lily was 4. "That must have been unbearable," Grace said, and there was no pity in her voice, only understanding, the kind that only comes from someone who has sat with grief many times before, even if it was not her own. "It still is, some days," Marcus admitted, surprising himself with his own honesty. "But Lily keeps me moving forward. She has this way of asking questions that force me to keep living, instead of just existing." The whispering at the nearby table had quieted somewhat, though Marcus noticed one of the women still glancing over occasionally, her expression unreadable. He found, strangely, that he no longer cared as much as he had 10 minutes earlier. Something about Grace's steadiness was contagious, and he realized he had not thought about his phone, or the babysitter, or his usual list of anxieties, in several minutes. Their food arrived, and the conversation continued to flow easily, touching on small things and large things in equal measure. Grace told him about a difficult week at the hospital, about a child patient who had finally been discharged after months of treatment, and the joy on the family's faces when they left. Marcus told her about the bridge project he was currently overseeing, and how Lily had once asked him if he could build a bridge to the moon. "What did you tell her?" Grace asked, smiling. I told her I would need a very long weekend, Marcus said, and Grace laughed. A full and genuine laugh that turned a few more heads in the restaurant, though this time Marcus did not mind at all. As the evening went on, Marcus began to notice details about Grace that had nothing to do with her size, and everything to do with who she was. The way she listened with her whole body, leaning slightly forward, her eyes never drifting to her phone. The way she remembered small details he had mentioned earlier, and brought them back up later, proving she had truly been listening. The way she laughed easily, but also knew when to be quiet, when a story needed space, rather than a response. He also noticed, with a small ache of shame, how aware she seemed to be of the room around her, how she occasionally scanned the space near their table, not with anxiety, but with the practiced awareness of someone who had learned, over years, to expect judgment and prepare for it calmly, rather than let it catch her off guard. Marcus wondered, as the dinner stretched past the 1-hour mark he had promised himself he could survive, how many rooms like this one Grace had walked into over the years, how many whispered comments she had absorbed and set aside without ever showing the sting of them. He wondered how a person built that kind of strength, and whether he had anything close to it himself. Can I ask you something? Marcus said, as the waiter cleared their plates. Of course. Does it bother you? The way people look at you sometimes, like at that table earlier. Grace considered the question seriously, not brushing it off the way Marcus half expected. It used to bother me a great deal. When I was younger, I spent my early 20s trying to become smaller, in every sense of the word. Smaller portions, smaller opinions, smaller presence in every room I entered. It never worked, and it made me miserable trying. At some point, I decided that other people's discomfort with how I look is their responsibility to manage, not mine. I still notice the looks, Marcus. I am not immune to them. I have just decided they do not get to decide how I feel about myself anymore. Marcus sat with that for a long moment, the noise of the restaurant fading into the background. He thought about his own life, about the ways grief had made him small too, in different ways, how he had spent 2 years shrinking his own needs down to nothing, so there would be more room for Lily's. He thought about how exhausting it was, the constant management of other people's expectations, whether those expectations were about weight, or widowhood, or fatherhood, or anything else. I think, he said slowly, that might be the wisest thing anyone has said to me in a very long time. Grace smiled at him, and this time there was something softer in it, something that told Marcus the evening had shifted into new territory neither of them had fully expected when they walked through the restaurant doors an hour and a half earlier. Neither of them noticed, in that moment, that the whispering at the nearby table had started again, quieter this time, but no less pointed. Neither of them noticed the way one particular woman at that table kept glancing over, her expression tightening with something that looked less like curiosity and more like disapproval. The evening had settled into something warm and comfortable, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, Marcus Bell had almost entirely forgotten to be afraid. He had no way of knowing that the quiet judgment building at the next table was about to turn into something much louder, something that would test Grace far more directly than a few whispered comments ever could. He had no way of knowing that within the hour, the entire restaurant would fall completely silent, and that when the silence broke, nothing about this evening, or about his understanding of the woman across from him, would ever be the same again. For now, he simply reached for his water glass, caught Grace's eye across the candlelight, and felt, for the first time in 2 years, something that was not quite happiness yet, but was undeniably its beginning. The dessert menu arrived, and Grace tapped the page thoughtfully. I have a rule, she said. I never turn down chocolate cake on a first date. It tells me a lot about a person, whether they order dessert or pretend they are too full. Then we are ordering 2, Marcus said, and Grace grinned, and somewhere behind them, the whispering continued, low and unresolved, waiting for a moment neither of them could yet predict. Marcus did not know it then, but the woman at the next table was not simply gossiping out of idle boredom. She was building toward something, gathering the nerve for a comment she had clearly wanted to make since the moment Grace walked through the door. And when that comment finally came, it would not be quiet enough to ignore, and it would not be aimed at just anyone. It would be aimed directly at Grace, in front of the entire room, and it would demand a response that neither Marcus nor anyone else in that restaurant was prepared for. The evening, which had begun with Marcus's shaking hands and reluctant footsteps, was about to become something far more significant than either of them had imagined when they sat down. But for now, the cake arrived, warm and rich, and Grace laughed at something Marcus said about Lily's dinosaur drawings, and the candle between them flickered steadily, unaware of the storm gathering just a few tables away. Grace cut into her slice of chocolate cake with the same unhurried confidence she seemed to bring to everything, and Marcus found himself watching her rather than his own dessert, curious about the layers of this woman that Karen's brief description had never captured. "Tell me about your work," he said. "Karen said you are a pediatric nurse, but she never told me what that actually looks like day to day." Grace set down her fork and thought about the question seriously, the way she seemed to think about everything, rather than offering the quick rehearsed answer most people gave when asked about their jobs. "It looks like a lot of things. Some days it is simple, checking vitals, changing dressings, handing out stickers to kids who are brave during their shots. Other days it is much harder. I work mostly with children who have long-term illnesses, which means I get to know families over months, sometimes years, not just for a single visit." "That sounds like it would be difficult to do without it wearing you down eventually," Marcus said. "It is," Grace admitted. "I have learned to carry it differently than I used to. In my first 2 years, I took every hard case home with me. I would lie awake thinking about a particular child, a particular family, wondering if there was something more I could have done. My supervisor at the time, a woman named Helen, the same one I mentioned earlier from my grandmother's care, actually became my mentor years later. She was the one who taught me that caring deeply and carrying everything home are two very different things. You can do the first without doing the second, but it takes practice." Marcus nodded slowly, turning his water glass in his hand. "I think I understand that more than I would like to. After Diane died, I felt like I had to carry everything, every decision, every worry about Lily, entirely by myself. It took me almost a year to realize I did not have to do it that way. My sister kept telling me I was allowed to ask for help, and I kept not listening." "Karen mentioned that," Grace said gently. "She worries about you a great deal." "She worries about everyone a great deal," Marcus said, smiling. "It is practically her full-time job outside of actual work." Grace laughed, and the sound of it was warm and unguarded, drawing a brief glance from the waiter passing their table. Marcus found himself smiling just from hearing it, something loosening further in his chest with every passing minute. "Can I ask you something a little more personal?" Grace said, setting her fork down. "Go ahead. What was Diane like? You do not have to answer if it feels like too much. I just find that people rarely get asked to actually talk about the person they lost, past the first few months. Everyone assumes bringing it up will hurt, so they stop asking, and then the person feels like they are not allowed to remember out loud anymore." Marcus felt something catch in his throat, not from pain exactly, but from surprise. No one had asked him that question so directly in a very long time. "She was stubborn," he said finally, a small smile pulling at the corner of his mouth. "Incredibly stubborn. She used to argue with me about the smallest things, like which way the toilet paper roll should face, and she would never, ever admit she was wrong, even when she clearly was. She was also the most patient person I have ever known with Lily. She used to read the same book to her every single night for almost 2 months straight because Lily refused to hear any other story, and Diane never once complained about it." "She sounds wonderful," Grace said softly. "She was," Marcus agreed. "Lily has her eyes. Sometimes when Lily laughs a certain way, it catches me off guard, because for just a second, it feels like Diane is right there in the room." Grace reached across the table, not quite touching his hand, but close enough that the gesture felt warm rather than intrusive. "Thank you for telling me that. I know it is not always easy to talk about." "It is easier than I expected, actually," Marcus said, and meant it. The restaurant had grown a little quieter around them as the evening wore on, other tables finishing their meals and drifting out into the night, though the group of women 2 tables away remained, their conversation occasionally rising, just loud enough for stray words to carry over. Marcus noticed it but did not let it interrupt the rhythm he and Grace had settled into, a rhythm that felt, strangely, like something he had known for far longer than 2 hours. "What about you?" he asked. "Have you been on many blind dates before this one?" Karen made it sound like this was a rare event for you too. Grace made a small, amused sound. "A few. Not many good ones, if I am honest. There was one man who spent the entire dinner talking about his ex-girlfriend, comparing everything about the restaurant to places she used to take him. There was another who seemed nice enough, until he made a comment about how brave I was for wearing a dress that fit me, as though showing up in clothes that actually fit my body was some kind of extraordinary act of courage, rather than just getting dressed in the morning. Marcus felt a flash of irritation on her behalf, sharp and immediate. That is an absurd thing to say to someone. People say absurd things constantly, Grace said, without bitterness, simply stating a fact she had long since made peace with. I stopped expecting better from strangers a long time ago. It saves a great deal of disappointment. That should not have to be true, Marcus said quietly. Grace looked at him for a long moment, something thoughtful passing behind her eyes. No, it should not. But it is. For now. I have found that the people worth keeping in my life are the ones who never made me feel like I needed to earn basic respect. My brothers are like that. My closest friend from nursing school is like that. Karen, actually, has been like that from the very first day we worked together. Though I suspect you already knew she was that kind of person. She is, Marcus agreed. She has been the only steady thing in my life since Diane died. Besides Lily. I do not know what I would have done without her these past 2 years. Their conversation drifted for a while into lighter territory, Grace telling him about a particularly memorable birthday party she had organized for a young patient who had been in the hospital for 3 straight months, complete with a small parade of nurses in superhero capes, marching through the hallway to deliver cupcakes. Marcus told her about the time Lily had insisted on wearing rain boots to a job site visit because she wanted to look like her father, and had refused to take them off even after the visit had ended, wearing them to bed that night as well. She sounds like she has your stubbornness, Grace said, smiling. She has Diane's stubbornness, Marcus corrected. I am simply the one who has to deal with the consequences of it daily. As the evening deepened, Marcus noticed the way Grace occasionally paused mid-sentence to glance toward the table of women nearby, not out of anxiety, but out of the same practiced awareness he had noticed earlier, a habit built from years of navigating spaces that were not always kind to her. He wondered how exhausting it must be, to always keep part of your attention reserved for potential judgment, even during a pleasant evening like this one. Does it ever get easier? He asked, before he could stop himself, being aware of that, all the time. Grace understood immediately what he meant, without him needing to explain further. It gets more familiar, she said. I would not call it easier exactly. I have simply had more practice recognizing it, and more practice deciding it does not deserve my full attention. Most days, I genuinely do not think about it much at all. I go to work. I care for my patients. I come home. I call my brothers. I read my books. It is only in moments like tonight, in a room full of strangers who have decided to make their opinions audible, that I am reminded how much space other people believe they are entitled to take up in my evening. Marcus felt a quiet anger stirring in him again, directed not at Grace but at the world that had taught her to expect this kind of treatment as a baseline. For what it is worth, he said, I have not noticed anything about tonight except how much I am enjoying talking to you. Grace's expression softened, something genuine and slightly surprised crossing her face, as though she had not expected him to say something so plainly sincere. That is a kind thing to say. It is a true thing to say, Marcus replied. The waiter returned to check on them, and Grace ordered a coffee, Marcus following her lead, neither of them ready yet for the evening to end, despite the 2.5 hours that had already passed. Marcus realized, somewhere in the back of his mind, that he had not thought once about leaving early, had not checked the time with any anxiety, had not spent a single moment wishing he was somewhere else. He could not remember the last time an evening had felt this easy. Tell me something about you that Karen would never think to mention, Grace said, stirring sugar into her coffee. Marcus thought for a moment. I used to want to be an architect, not an engineer. I actually started college in the architecture program before switching. I liked the idea of designing beautiful buildings, but I discovered I liked the math and the structural problem solving even more than the aesthetics. Diane used to tease me that I fell in love with the skeleton of buildings instead of their faces. Grace laughed. That is a very specific and very charming way to describe a career change. She had a talent for finding the exact right words for things, Marcus said, something wistful in his voice, though not painfully so. It is one of the things I miss most. She could describe a feeling in a single sentence, that would have taken me an entire paragraph to explain badly. "You described things well yourself," Grace offered. "The way you talked about Lily's rain boots, or the bridge to the moon. You clearly noticed details most people would miss." "Maybe I picked some of it up from her," Marcus said. "Or maybe I just pay attention because Lily is the only audience I have most days, and 4-year-olds demand very specific and very detailed storytelling." Grace smiled at that, and for a while they simply sat together in comfortable silence, sipping their coffee, the low murmur of the restaurant settling around them like a warm blanket. Marcus found himself studying her face in the candlelight, the easy confidence in her expression, the intelligence behind her eyes, the way she seemed entirely comfortable being exactly who she was, in a room that had not always been kind to her. He thought about how rare that kind of steadiness was, how most people, himself included, spent so much energy trying to manage how others perceived them. Grace seemed to have found a way to set that burden down entirely, or at least to carry it so lightly that it no longer weighed on her the way it clearly still weighed on others, judging by the persistent whispers still drifting from the nearby table. Neither of them noticed, in that quiet, comfortable moment, that the whispering 2 tables away had shifted in tone, had grown sharper, more deliberate, as though the woman speaking had finally worked up the nerve to say something she had been holding back all evening. Neither of them noticed the way she set down her wine glass with a little too much force, or the way her friends exchanged uneasy glances, as though bracing themselves for something they knew was about to happen. Marcus was in the middle of telling Grace about the first time Lily had asked him whether her mother could see her from heaven, and how he had answered as honestly as he could manage while still being gentle, when a voice cut clearly across the restaurant, loud enough that it could not be mistaken for anything but deliberate. "I just think it is strange," the woman said, not quite looking at their table but clearly speaking for their benefit, her words pitched to Carrie. "A man like that, good-looking, put together, and he ends up with someone like her. I mean, does he not have any other options at all?" The words landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water, rippling outward into a silence that had not existed a moment before. Conversations at nearby tables faltered. A server paused mid-step near the kitchen door, glancing over with wide eyes. Marcus felt his entire body go rigid, heat rushing to his face, a sharp, furious retort already forming on his tongue. Grace, however, did not flinch. She set down her coffee cup slowly, deliberately, the small clink of porcelain against saucer somehow audible in the sudden quiet of the room. She did not look angry. She did not look embarrassed. She looked, instead, calm in a way that Marcus would later realize took far more strength than any angry outburst ever could. "I was wondering when someone was going to say it out loud," Grace said, her voice steady, carrying clearly across the now silent restaurant. "You have been circling around it for the better part of an hour." The woman at the other table opened her mouth as if to respond, then closed it again, clearly not having expected to be addressed so directly. Marcus started to speak, some protective instinct rising up in him, but Grace placed her hand gently on the table between them, not touching him, but somehow signaling, without a single word, that she wanted to handle this herself. Marcus swallowed his words and watched, his heart pounding, as Grace rose slowly from her chair, smoothing the front of her green dress with quiet composure, and turned to face the room that had, for the last 2 hours, been watching her out of the corners of dozens of curious and judgmental eyes. The restaurant had gone almost entirely silent now, every table within earshot turning to watch. Forks paused halfway to mouths, conversations abandoned mid-sentence. Even the soft background music seemed to fade into the edges of the room, as though the entire space was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Grace stood there for a moment, unhurried, gathering her thoughts the way Marcus imagined she must gather herself before delivering difficult news to a frightened family in a hospital hallway. And then, in a voice that was calm, clear, and utterly without apology, she began to speak. "I have been a nurse for 11 years, Grace began, her voice steady, filling the silent room without any need to raise it. "In that time, I have sat with more grieving families than I can count. I have held the hands of children who were more frightened than any adult in this room has ever been in their entire life. I have watched parents say goodbye to their sons and daughters, and I have watched those same parents find a way to keep breathing the next morning, because that is what love asks of us, even when it is unbearable." She paused, letting her gaze move slowly around the room, not with anger, but with a kind of quiet authority that made no one look away. "You asked whether this man has other options," Grace continued, nodding once toward the woman who had spoken. "I am sure he does. He is kind, he is thoughtful, he is clearly devoted to his daughter, and from what I have learned tonight, he carried his family through the worst thing that can happen to a person without ever once letting his little girl feel unsafe. Men like that generally have plenty of options. The question you should be asking is not why he chose to sit across from me tonight. The question is why you assumed, the moment you saw us together, that my body somehow disqualifies me from being one of those options." A few heads in the room turned toward the woman who had made the original comment. She shifted in her seat, her face reddening, though she said nothing. "I have spent my entire adult life being told, in ways large and small, that I take up too much space," Grace said, her voice never wavering. "Too much space at a table, too much space in a doorway. Too much space, apparently, sitting across from a man who is simply enjoying a conversation with me. I stopped believing that a long time ago, not because it stopped being said, but because I decided I was done letting strangers determine my worth, based on measurements they have never bothered to understand." She glanced briefly at Marcus, something soft passing over her expression before she turned back to the room. "I once cared for a little girl named Ivy," Grace said, her voice dropping slightly, though it lost none of its clarity. "She was 7 years old, and she fought a very difficult illness for almost a year before she passed away. Her father used to sit by her bed every single night, reading to her the same 3 books over and over, because those were the books she loved, and he never once complained about the repetition, because he understood that comfort mattered more than novelty when someone you love is frightened. He held her hand until the very last moment. And do you know what I learned? Watching that man love his daughter so completely, so without condition or hesitation." The room remained utterly silent, waiting. "I learned that real love, the kind that actually matters, has nothing to do with appearances," Grace said. "It has nothing to do with waistlines or dress sizes, or whatever standard someone decides to measure another person against from across a restaurant. It has to do with showing up. It has to do with staying. It has to do with choosing someone, again and again, especially on the hard days, especially when it would be easier to walk away. That father taught me more about love in 11 months than most people learn in a lifetime, and not once, in all that time, did I hear anyone in that hospital room comment on the size of his body or mine, because in that room, none of it mattered, only the love mattered." Grace's eyes moved slowly across the room one final time, and when she spoke again, her voice was quieter, but somehow carried even further into the stillness. "I do not need anyone in this restaurant to approve of who I have dinner with. I do not need your validation, and I certainly do not need your pity. What I would ask, if you are willing to hear it, is that the next time you see 2 people enjoying each other's company, you consider extending them the basic courtesy of minding your own evening, rather than deciding, within moments, that you understand something about their lives that you could not possibly know." She let the silence settle for a long moment, unhurried, entirely in command of the room, before she added, more gently, "Marcus asked me earlier tonight if the whispering ever bothers me. I told him it gets more familiar, but never easier. I think, now, I would like to correct myself. Tonight, sitting across from someone who has not once made me feel like I needed to apologize for existing, I realize it does get easier. It gets easier when you find people who remind you what actually matters." The restaurant remained silent for what felt like a very long time, though it could not have been more than a few seconds. Then, from a table near the back, an older man began to clap, slowly at first, and then with more conviction. A young woman near the window joined him. Within moments, a soft ripple of applause moved through the room, not loud or boisterous, but sincere, the kind of applause that comes from people who have just witnessed something they will remember for a long time. The woman who had made the original comment sat frozen in her chair, her face pale now rather than red, clearly understanding for the first time the full weight of what she had said aloud. Her friends at the table avoided looking at her, and one of them, after a long, uncomfortable pause, quietly signaled for the check. Grace sat back down at the table, her composure unbroken, though Marcus noticed the faintest tremor in her hands as she reached for her coffee cup, the only sign that the moment had cost her something, even if she had not let it show on her face. "I am sorry," she said quietly. once the room's attention had drifted elsewhere, and the ordinary murmur of conversation had slowly resumed. That was not exactly the blind date experience Karen promised you. Marcus shook his head slowly, still processing what he had just witnessed. Grace, that was one of the most remarkable things I have ever seen anyone do. It was necessary, Grace said simply. I have learned that silence, in moments like that, only teaches people that the behavior is acceptable. I would rather say something uncomfortable and true than sit quietly and let it pass. I could not have said any of that as well as you just did, Marcus admitted. I wanted to say something the moment she spoke, but I was so angry I think I would have just made things worse. Anger has its place, Grace said, but anger rarely changes anyone's mind. I have found that people are far more likely to actually hear you if you speak calmly, even when what you are saying is difficult. It took me years to learn that. I used to respond to comments like that with fury, and it never once made me feel better afterward. It just left me feeling drained and unheard. Marcus reached across the table then, and this time he did take her hand, gently, his fingers wrapping around hers with a certainty that surprised even him. For what it is worth, I heard every single word. Grace looked down at their joined hands for a moment, something vulnerable passing briefly across her steady expression, before she looked back up at him with a small, genuine smile. Thank you, Marcus. They sat together for a while longer, the restaurant slowly emptying around them. As the evening wound down, the tension of the earlier moment fading into something quieter and more contemplative. Marcus found himself thinking about Ivy, the little girl Grace had described, and about her father sitting by her bedside every night, reading the same 3 books without complaint. He thought about Diane, about the nights he had spent reading to Lily long after she should have been asleep, simply because she needed the comfort of his voice and his presence more than she needed anything else. He thought about how much of what mattered in life had nothing to do with appearances at all, and how strange it was that it had taken a stranger's careless comment, and Grace's steady response to it, to remind him of something he already knew deep down, but had somehow forgotten to practice in his own life. Can I ask you something? Marcus said, after a comfortable silence had settled between them. Of course. Would you want to do this again? Not because Karen arranged it this time, but because we actually wanted to. Grace's smile widened, warm and unguarded. I would like that very much, Marcus. Outside, through the restaurant window, the night had grown fully dark, streetlights casting soft golden pools onto the sidewalk. Marcus glanced out at the quiet street, then back at Grace, and felt, for the first time in longer than he could remember, something that felt distinctly like hope, steady and unhurried, settling into the space where fear had lived for the past 2 years. Neither of them could have known, in that quiet moment, just how much that single evening would come to shape the months that followed, or how the woman who had spoken so carelessly across the restaurant would, in her own way, become an unlikely footnote in a story that was only just beginning. 3 weeks passed before Marcus worked up the courage to introduce Grace to Lily. It was not that he doubted Grace, not anymore. Not after the way she had carried herself that first night, and certainly not after the 2 dinners and 1 long phone call that had followed since. It was that he had learned, the hard way, how carefully he needed to guard his daughter's heart. Lily had already lost 1 parent, and Marcus refused to bring anyone into her life who was not going to stay. He mentioned this to Grace over the phone one evening, his voice careful, testing the weight of the words before he said them fully. I need you to know that if this becomes something serious, it becomes serious for Lily too. I cannot introduce her to someone, and then have that person disappear a few months later. She has already lost enough. Grace was quiet on the other end of the line for a moment, and when she spoke, her voice was gentle but sure. Marcus, I understand completely. I would never ask to meet her unless I meant to stay in her life, in whatever way feels right, for as long as you both want me there. I am not going anywhere, just because things get complicated. That certainty, delivered without hesitation, was what finally convinced him. The following Saturday, Grace came to Marcus's small house on the edge of town, carrying a paper bag that she refused to explain the contents of until she arrived. Lily, who had been told only that Daddy's friend Grace was coming over, greeted her at the door with the blunt curiosity only a 6-year-old could manage. Are you the lady from the dinner? Lily asked, peering up at Grace with wide, assessing eyes. I am, Grace said, crouching down slightly so she was closer to Lily's height. Your daddy told me you like dinosaurs. Is that true? Lily's entire face transformed with delight. I love dinosaurs. I have 42 of them. Do you want to see? I would love nothing more, Grace said, and Lily grabbed her hand without hesitation, pulling her toward the living room, where an army of plastic dinosaurs stood arranged in careful battle formations across the carpet. Marcus watched from the doorway, something tight and hopeful lodged in his throat, as Grace lowered herself onto the floor, without any concern for her dress, and allowed Lily to walk her through the entire collection, dinosaur by dinosaur, explaining each one's name and personality with the seriousness of a museum curator. Grace asked genuine questions, remembered the names Lily gave her, and even engaged in a brief but intense negotiation over whether the Triceratops or the Stegosaurus would win in a hypothetical battle. Later, when Lily had gone to retrieve yet another dinosaur from her room, Grace finally revealed the contents of the paper bag, a children's book about a young paleontologist, and a small stuffed dinosaur wearing, Marcus noticed with a laugh, a tiny knitted tie. I saw it and thought of the drawing Karen told me about, Grace said, a little sheepishly. The lonely dinosaur in a tie. I thought this one could keep him company. Marcus felt something in his chest give way entirely in that moment, some final wall he had not even realized he was still holding up. He watched Lily return, spot the stuffed dinosaur immediately, and let out a delighted shriek before scooping it into her arms and declaring, with complete confidence, that Grace was now her favorite grown-up, aside from her father. The weeks that followed unfolded gently, without the drama Marcus had half-braced himself for. Grace became a steady, welcome presence in their lives, joining them for Sunday dinners, attending Lily's school art show where a slightly lopsided painting of a dinosaur wearing a tie hung proudly on the classroom wall, and slowly, carefully, becoming someone Lily looked forward to seeing, rather than someone she merely tolerated. Not every moment was easy. There were still occasional stares when the three of them went out together, still the rare unkind comment overheard in a grocery store or a school pickup line. Marcus found himself far less patient with these moments than Grace was, his protective instincts flaring hot and immediate, though Grace continued to handle each instance with the same calm steadiness she had shown that first night, occasionally reminding him gently that his anger, while well-meant, was not always the response the situation needed. You cannot fight every battle for me, she told him one evening, after he had nearly confronted a stranger in a parking lot over a muttered comment neither of them had fully heard. I appreciate that you want to, but I have spent a long time learning how to carry these moments myself, and I need you to trust that I know how to handle them. Marcus nodded, chastened but understanding. I just hate that you have to handle them at all. So do I, Grace admitted, but hating it will not make it disappear. What helps is having someone who does not add to it. You have never once done that, Marcus. Not from the very first night. That matters more than you know. It was in the 6th week of their relationship that the real test arrived, though not in the form either of them had expected. Lily woke one Tuesday morning with a fever that climbed steadily throughout the day despite Marcus's best efforts, and by evening she was listless, complaining of a headache so severe she could barely keep her eyes open. Marcus, his fear from 2 years earlier rising sharp and immediate in his chest, called Grace, before he had even fully decided to, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. I do not know if this is serious, or if I am overreacting, he admitted, pacing the length of the hallway outside Lily's room. She has never had a fever this high before. I keep thinking about Diane, about how fast everything happened, and I cannot make my brain stop running through worst-case scenarios. Marcus, listen to me, Grace said, her voice immediately shifting into the calm, clinical steadiness he had come to associate with her professional life. What is her temperature right now? 103, Marcus said. It was 102 an hour ago. Has she vomited? Is she having trouble breathing? Is she responsive when you talk to her? Marcus checked, his hands shaking slightly as he crouched beside Lily's bed. She answered me, but she sounds tired. No vomiting. Breathing seems normal. Okay, Grace said. That is good, Marcus. That is genuinely good. A fever that high in a child her age is concerning, but it does not automatically mean something catastrophic. I want you to give her the dose of fever reducer the pediatrician recommended, and I am coming over right now. If anything changes before I get there, if her breathing becomes labored or she becomes unresponsive, you call for emergency help immediately, Do you understand? I understand, Marcus said, gripping the phone tightly. Grace arrived within 20 minutes, moving through the house with the calm efficiency of someone who had spent over a decade responding to frightened parents in far more serious circumstances. She checked Lily gently, asking her simple questions in a soft, reassuring voice, checking her pulse, watching her breathing, running through a mental checklist that Marcus could see forming behind her steady eyes. I think this is a viral infection, Grace said finally, after nearly 20 minutes of careful observation. Her symptoms line up with something going around right now, nothing that points toward anything more serious, but I want you to call her pediatrician first thing in the morning if the fever has not broken by then, and if anything changes tonight, anything at all, we go to the emergency room immediately, no hesitation. Marcus nodded, some of the panic in his chest easing slightly under the weight of Grace's calm competence. Thank you. I know I probably overreacted. You did not overreact, Grace said firmly. You are a father who lost his wife suddenly and without warning. Of course, a high fever in your daughter sends you into panic. That is not overreaction, Marcus. That is love shaped by grief. There is nothing wrong with that. They stayed up together that night, taking turns checking on Lily every hour, Grace insisting on staying on the couch rather than leaving, despite Marcus's protests that she needed her own rest before her shift the next day. By early morning, Lily's fever had finally broken, her small body relaxing into a deeper, more peaceful sleep, and Marcus, exhausted and finally able to breathe fully again, found Grace asleep sitting upright on the couch, still in the same clothes she had arrived in the night before. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching her, and understood with sudden and complete clarity that this was not simply a pleasant new relationship unfolding at a comfortable pace. This was something far more significant, something built on the kind of steadiness that showed itself most clearly, not during easy moments, but during frightening ones. He gently woke her with a cup of coffee, and when she opened her eyes and immediately asked about Lily's temperature before she had even fully registered where she was, Marcus felt something settle permanently into place inside him, a certainty he had not expected to feel again after Diane, a certainty that told him, quietly but unmistakably, that Grace was someone he wanted in his life, and in Lily's life, for a very long time to come. Her fever broke around 4, Marcus said. She is sleeping peacefully now. Grace exhaled, relief washing visibly over her face. That is wonderful news. Grace, Marcus said, sitting down beside her. Thank you, not just for last night, for all of it. For the way you were with her at the restaurant that first night, for the way you have been with Lily every single week since, for showing up at midnight because I panicked over a fever. I do not think I have properly told you how much all of that means to me. Grace looked at him for a long moment, something soft and unguarded passing across her tired face. You do not need to thank me for showing up, Marcus. That is simply what people who care about each other do. Outside, the early morning light was beginning to spread across the horizon, pale and golden, filtering through the kitchen window and settling across the two of them as they sat together in comfortable, exhausted silence. Marcus thought about the whispered comment in the restaurant weeks earlier, about the woman who had assumed she understood something about worth and value simply by looking at Grace from across a room, and felt a fierce, quiet gratitude that he had not let that moment, or any moment since, change his mind about the woman sitting beside him. He had no way of knowing, in that quiet golden morning, just how much further this steady, unhurried love would carry all three of them in the months ahead, or how completely it would reshape what he believed a family could look like after loss. But he knew, with a certainty that felt entirely new and entirely welcome, that he was no longer simply surviving. For the first time in 2 years, Marcus Bell was beginning, quietly and steadily, to truly live again. A year passed, and the small house on the edge of town began to feel different in ways that were difficult to name, but impossible to ignore. There was laughter that filled the rooms more often now, coming not just from Lily's endless games and stories, but from Marcus himself, whose serious jaw, the one Grace had teased him about on their very first evening together, had softened into something far more relaxed, something that smiled more easily than it had in years. Grace had become a fixture in their lives so gradually and so naturally that neither Marcus nor Lily could quite pinpoint the exact moment she stopped feeling like a guest and started feeling like family. Her toothbrush sat beside theirs in the bathroom now. Her favorite mug, A chipped blue one with a small chip on the handle that she refused to replace out of sentimentality, had a permanent place in the kitchen cabinet. Lily had taken to calling her Grace still, never forcing a different title onto her, but the affection in the way she said the name had deepened into something unmistakably close to the way she said the word Daddy. It was on a quiet Sunday afternoon, nearly 14 months after that first nervous dinner, that Marcus found himself standing in the same kitchen where Grace had once handed him coffee, after a sleepless night of fever watching, holding a small velvet box he had carried in his coat pocket for nearly 3 weeks, waiting for the right moment that never seemed to fully announce itself. He had not planned a large gesture. He knew by now that Grace was not someone who needed elaborate declarations to feel valued. She had told him once, months earlier, that the thing she appreciated most about their relationship was its steadiness, the fact that neither of them ever seemed to be performing for an audience, that everything between them felt real, precisely because it was quiet and unhurried and entirely their own. So instead of a grand restaurant or a crowded public moment, Marcus chose their kitchen, on an ordinary Sunday, with Lily's crayon drawings taped haphazardly to the refrigerator behind them, and the smell of the pancakes Grace had made that morning still lingering in the air. "Grace," he said, and something in his voice made her set down the dish towel she had been holding and turn to look at him fully. "Marcus, what is it?" He took a breath, steadying himself the way he had steadied himself outside the restaurant door over a year earlier, though this time the nervousness was mixed with something entirely different, something certain and warm rather than frightened. "I have thought about how to say this for weeks, and I keep coming back to the same thing, which is that I do not need elaborate words. I just need you to know that from the very first night, when you stood up in that restaurant and told an entire room exactly what it needed to hear, I understood that I was in the presence of someone extraordinary. I have watched you show up for Lily and for me, again and again, in ways both small and enormous, and I do not want to spend another year, or another day if I can help it, without making that permanent." He opened the box, and Grace's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes immediately filling with tears that did nothing to diminish the wide, unguarded smile spreading across her face. "Marcus," she said, her voice thick. "I love you," Marcus said simply. "I love the way you love Lily. I love the way you have loved me through the hardest and easiest moments of the past year, and I would be endlessly grateful if you would marry me." Grace crossed the small kitchen in 2 steps, and pulled him into an embrace before he had even finished the sentence, her answer arriving, not in words at first, but in the fierce, certain way she held on to him. "Yes," she said finally, pulling back just enough to look at him, tears streaking freely down her face now. "Yes, Marcus, of course, yes." From the doorway, unnoticed until that exact moment, came a small, delighted gasp, followed immediately by the sound of quick footsteps, as Lily launched herself into the middle of the celebration, having apparently been listening from the hallway the entire time. "Are you going to be my mom now?" Lily asked, breathless with excitement, looking up at Grace with an expression of such open hope that both adults felt their hearts nearly break with tenderness. Grace crouched down to Lily's level, wiping at her own tears, and took both of Lily's small hands in hers. "I would be honored to be however much of a mom you want me to be, Lily. I am not here to replace anyone. Your mom will always be your mom, and I know how much your dad has told you about her, but I would love nothing more than to be here for you, every single day, for as long as you will have me." Lily considered this with the serious, careful thoughtfulness that 6-year-olds sometimes surprise adults with, and then nodded firmly, as though the matter had been settled entirely to her satisfaction. "Okay, can we still fight about who gets the last pancake, though?" Grace laughed through her tears, pulling Lily into a hug. "We can absolutely still fight about the pancakes." The wedding took place 8 months later, in early autumn, in the backyard of the small house that had slowly become a home for all 3 of them. It was a modest gathering, close family, and a handful of close friends. String lights hung between the trees and folding chairs arranged in careful rows across the grass. Karen stood as Grace's maid of honor, tears streaming down her face throughout the entire ceremony, occasionally leaning over to whisper to the guest beside her that she had known, from the very first moment she arranged that blind date, that something extraordinary might come of it. Lily, dressed in a small white dress with a flower crown slightly askew on her head, walked down the aisle scattering flower petals with the fierce concentration of someone completing an extremely important job, occasionally pausing to make sure everyone was watching her do it properly. During the ceremony, when it came time for the couple to speak their own vows, Grace's voice, steady as always, carried clearly across the quiet backyard. A little over a year ago, I walked into a restaurant expecting an ordinary dinner, and instead, I found a man who never once made me feel like I needed to apologize for taking up space in his life, she said. I found a little girl who taught me, within moments of meeting her, that love does not require perfect timing or perfect circumstances, only an open heart and a willingness to show up. I promise you, Marcus, that I will keep showing up, on the easy days and the frightening ones, for as long as you will have me. Marcus, his own voice thick with emotion, spoke of the courage it had taken Grace to stand up in that restaurant on their very first night, of the steadiness she had shown through a midnight fever scare, of the countless small ways she had woven herself into their lives, until the house finally felt whole again after 2 years of quiet grief. You taught me that starting over does not mean forgetting what came before, he said. It means making room for something new without erasing anything that mattered. I promise to keep making that room, every single day, for the rest of our lives together. As the sun began to set behind the trees, casting the small backyard gathering in warm golden light, Marcus thought back, as he often did on quiet reflective evenings, to the restaurant table where it had all begun, to the whispered judgment that had briefly threatened to overshadow the evening, and to the steady, unflinching way Grace had turned that moment into something entirely different. He thought about how a single evening, one that had begun with his hands shaking outside a restaurant door, had ultimately reshaped the entire course of his life, and Lily's life, proving something he now understood more deeply than he ever had before. The measure of a person had nothing to do with the space they occupied in a room. It had everything to do with the space they made for others in their heart. And by that measure, Marcus knew, watching his new wife scoop his laughing daughter into her arms beneath the string lights, that he had found something rare, something worth every ounce of the fear it had taken to walk through that restaurant door, on an ordinary evening that had, against every quiet expectation, become the beginning of everything that mattered most.